On with a series of mind control in Canada. We've heard over the last 3 weeks a lecture by Dr. Colin Ross about the history of the CIA and military mind control experimentation programs, documented history. Today we're going to start an interview, part one of a two-part interview with Dr. Colin Ross as we go into a bit more detail and explore the other many issues around this situation. You're listening to CKLN 88.1. I'm speaking with Dr. Colin Ross, a psychiatrist and researcher practicing in Dallas, Texas. And Dr. Ross, I wonder if you could just briefly describe who you are and what your current work is.
Sure. I'm a Canadian by birth and training. I went to medical school in Edmonton and did my psychiatry training in Winnipeg. I moved down here to Dallas just a little over 5 years ago. I'm a specialist in multiple personality disorder, and I've written a number of different books and lots of research papers and so on that. Right now, I'm working at a hospital in the Dallas area here. We have a program that we run on contract for the hospital, which treats mostly people with multiple personality disorder, also other related disorders. Most of the people that we treat describe very traumatic and abusive childhoods.
Now, what is a dissociative identity disorder, and is it the same thing as multiple personality disorder?
A dissociative identity disorder is the official new name for multiple personality disorder. Hasn't really caught on in the general language. It's a professional technical term. In 1994, that new diagnosis was introduced. It just replaces multiple personality disorder, and the criteria for diagnosing it have been changed a little bit, basically by adding a requirement for some type of amnesia. But basically means the same thing as multiple personality.
So what does it mean when somebody has this disorder? Well,
the basic criteria for diagnosing are pretty straightforward. You have these different personality states or identities that take turns being in control of the body, and there's some sort of amnesia or a memory barrier between the different personality states. Several important points to understand about this disorder are, first of all, it's not literally true that they have different personalities. They just have these fragmented components of one personality, and those have been referred to as different personalities for over 100 years, but they're not literally different personalities. There isn't really more than one person there. And there's several different ways you can end up having multiple personality. One way, which is what we think we see most of the time clinically, is where you've basically been physically, sexually, emotionally abused or neglected as a child. And you create these different identities to cope with it and hold different memories and feelings about it and so on. And that can be, as I said, a combination of various types of trauma in childhood. It has to be fairly serious trauma usually. Then another way that you can get multiple personality is where it's created either by mistake or deliberately by somebody else. And that could be in a bad therapy, which is all out of control and not being handled properly. And then the other major way of arriving at multiple personality disorder is people who have what's called a factitious disorder. That means that they deliberately fake having it, either to get into the patient role or get attention or get out of something or for some specific purpose.
Now, have you seen this disorder occur due to trauma as an adult, or does it specifically happen while a child?
Well, there's some cases reported in the literature, and there's the odd case where it's trauma that starts in adulthood, but vast majority of time it seems to be childhood.
Right. We've listened to your lecture talking about the history of U.S. mind control. You refer to the term iatrogenic. What does that mean?
Iatrogenic is just a Greek word that means created by the doctor. So iatrogenic multiple personality is multiple personality that's created by mistake by a bad therapist who's using improper techniques.
Okay. How did you get involved in working with people suffering from DID?
Well, I actually diagnosed my first case when I was a medical student in Edmonton, and just instantly found it really fascinating and interesting. And then when I was doing my 4 years of psychiatry training in Winnipeg, I saw one more case, and I thought it was going to be too rare to really specialize in. But then in '85, when I finished my psychiatry training, I diagnosed another case, and then I got some referrals, and then more referrals, and then I got a reputation for it, and ended up getting lots of referrals from all kinds of different people in Western Canada, and gradually sort of switched over to that being my specialty.
And this was when you were operating a practice in, is it Winnipeg or Edmonton at the time?
Yeah, Winnipeg.
Right.
I was a full-time university professor of psychiatry at one of the hospitals there.
And what did you find what were your findings from working with people with DID or MPD?
Well, I've published, just on multiple personality and related things, I've published probably about 60 or so papers in the professional literature, so I've found quite a few different things. But the main theme is, it really goes through the whole multiple personality literature, and that is that people who have this diagnosis clinically have lots of other things going on at the same time. Lots of depression, lots of anxiety, drug and alcohol problems, eating disorder problems, sleep problems. So they don't just have multiple personality. They got all kinds of different symptoms. They also tend to be in the healthcare system for quite a long period of time. Not all the time, but the majority of cases are in the healthcare system getting psychiatric treatment for one thing or another for quite a while, on average about 7 years, before the multiple personality is diagnosed. And the other theme that we see going all the time is this childhood trauma, that it arises as a way of coping with childhood trauma. And then we just actually just found out this week that a paper's been accepted at the American Journal of Psychiatry, where we assessed 103 people with this diagnosis here in Dallas about almost exactly 4 years ago now. And we gave them a whole bunch of different questionnaires and standardized tests and interviews and so on. And then we followed up as many as we could 2 years later, and we were able to follow up 54 of them. And the reduction in all these different symptoms was really impressive. And 12, already in the first 2 years of follow-up, 12 of the 54 people were all integrated back into one person. So they had a really dramatic and meaningful reduction in not just the amount of multiple personality-related symptoms, but depression, anxiety, substance abuse, all kinds of things. So this is the first scientifically designed kind of treatment outcome study that really shows that good treatment can be very helpful.
So these people that you're talking about did undergo treatment with you or other therapists?
They came to our hospital usually for an average of about 17 days or so. Mm-hmm. 70% of our people are from outside Texas, so they're from all over the United States. And we've had probably about 15 admissions of people from Ontario. And they then go home and are followed up by their therapists. So they only get about usually 2, 3, sometimes 4 weeks with us. And they may go into our day hospital program for a little bit as well. But basically they're followed up by therapists all over the country.
And are these therapists in contact with you in terms of methods of therapy?
Yeah, they've usually read my books and been to some of my workshops and are aware of my approach. But they don't have to necessarily follow my approach.
Right. And these other symptoms that you were talking about, do you feel that they were also a result of childhood trauma?
Yeah, the whole package seems to be related to childhood trauma. Now, we got a lot of controversy about this going on in society, in the psychology, psychiatry, sociology, and so on.
Right.
And we need a lot more research. But that's the best understanding I have right now. And there's a fair bit of research data that backs that up. It's not totally nailed down scientifically.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, from your experience working in Canada, how has the Canadian medical system responded to your findings in MPD research?
Well, roughly about the same as American. Overall, there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of political agitation, a fair bit of negative hostile propaganda and backstabbing about it. And then there's also quite a lot of support. And obviously, if I've gotten 50 or 60 professional papers published, I'm getting a reasonable reception. The main difference between Canada and the United States was, in Canada, I just couldn't get the financial or clinical support to set up and run a program. And the reason that's possible down here is because there's a private for-profit sector in the mental health system that's profit-driven, that's a business. And the hospital corporation I contract with is traded on the New York Stock Exchange and so on. And since I attract patients, then there's a financial motive for the hospital to be interested in me providing that service. So that financial motive allows the system to sort of set aside all of these ideological and political debates that go on, and so therefore I'm able to run a program.
So for the survivors of childhood abuse that you're dealing with, I guess they would have to have access to some kind of funds to be able to undergo therapy. What is your sense of people that have undergone this in childhood that do not have access to therapy?
Well, the breakdown in terms of insurance coverage that we have in our program is roughly about 50% are on Medicare, which is a government disability program. So they're sort of like Canadian healthcare system people in that their health insurance is basically paid for by the government. And they also get disability welfare type payments for their basic support and living. So half of our people are really insured in a way fairly similar to Canada. And then the other half have some sort of private insurance through their employers or their spouse's employers. If you're in the 1/3 of people in the United States who don't have proper medical insurance, then you can't get proper medical care, including psychiatric and including the kind we provide. So that would seem to be probably a reason to think that the Canadian healthcare system is superior to the U.S. The funny thing is that if you have multiple personality or a related disorder, your odds of getting treatment are actually better in the United States because there's more programs and more therapists available. In Canada, even though you have universal access and universal coverage, in actual practical reality, you can't get the treatment. So you got theoretical universal coverage for multiple personality and trauma-related disorders, but you don't have real practical coverage in reality. So that's sort of the paradox is that in the United States, actually a higher percentage of people who could benefit from psychotherapy for all kinds of problems arising from their childhoods, who can actually get therapy, is higher in the U.S.
Interesting. Now, in your previous lecture, you did go into a lot of detail outlining the history of mind control. What is the link between MPD and mind control experimentation?
Well, how I got into this is sort of a backdoor route. I didn't really have any interest in the CIA or the military or mind control research or all of that, particularly when I left Canada. Hadn't read about it, hadn't really heard any other doctors talking about it, hadn't heard any patients talking about it. And pretty soon after I arrived in Texas in early 1992, multiple personality patients started talking about kind of real strange experiences I didn't know what to make of, that involved either going into hospitals, some sort of research setting somewhere on a military base, and having different kinds of experiments done on them, which involved EEG machines or some kind of scientific equipment and sensory deprivation, maybe physical spinning, maybe hallucinogens. And it wasn't any kind of cult, and obviously wasn't just their parents or something going on in their family. And initially I thought that was really too much to believe. But then I decided I should at least look into it a little bit. So I started basically in early 92 doing a little bit of reading. And the more reading I did, what amazed me was that instead of coming to the conclusion, oh, well, this is not possible, there's no documentation of this kind of stuff, actually the more I read, the more documentation I got that all kinds of absolutely unbelievable and bizarre and unethical and harmful mind control research has been done in Canada and the United States since the Second World War. And I've actually interviewed and spoken with a number of people who have documented mind control research. Most of the patients that we work with who we hear these kind of things from, we get zero documentation that it's actually real. So I kind of disconnected my research and my study about this from the stories I was hearing from the patients and did it as a separate research project. And what I've done then over the last 5 years is talked to lots of other people in the field who are interested in this, read pretty well everything that's written on it, and through the Freedom of Information Act, I've got somewhere in probably in the ballpark of 6,000 or 7,000 pages of documents from the CIA, which I've reviewed, and then I've gone to the medical school library, and I've sent my secretary to 5 or 6 different places in the United States to go into archives and special collections and library resources and so on. So I've ended up now with probably more than almost 2 full 4-drawer filing cabinets full of documentation on all kinds of things. That's basically how I got into this. And the connection with multiple personality for me personally was just that my multiple personality patients were the ones who started telling these kind of stories and got me interested in it.
Right. Now, from from a therapist's point of view, how do you tell if somebody is giving you an account of actual abuse or whether they're just fabricating something?
Well, basically, all the professional associations, including the Canadian Psychiatric Association, that have made statements on this, and all the scientific research completely supports the conclusion that you can't tell. And that goes both ways.
You cannot tell.
You can't tell for sure just by listening to the patient's story. You can't tell that it's true. Also, you can't tell for sure that it's false. In other words, you can't tell one way or the other without some sort of outside proof. That is, proof that it really happened or proof that it really didn't happen. And what I've learned, especially in the last 5 years, is there's really no limit to how detailed, how compelling, how full of feeling, how detailed a bunch of memories can be, and be either totally real or never have happened. I've worked with people who've had really, really, really elaborate memories of all kinds of things with tremendous amount of detail, and then we've been able to prove it never happened.
Right, so that's...
You can't tell, and that's why I decided to do this research, kind of separated off from what the patients were telling me.
Right. Now, what similarities have you come across within the survivor accounts and what you've discovered in the CIA documentation about their mind control programs?
Well, basically, if you take a typical elaborate story that you'll hear from one of the multiple personality patients who have these kind of memories, and you break it down into the elements or components of the mind control techniques that they describe, I've been able to document just about every one, with maybe one or two exceptions. And all of this was carried out in a series of programs that really began in the Second World War with what was called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services.
The precursor to the CIA?
Yeah, it was set up immediately after Pearl Harbor when it became obvious that there was a huge problem with U.S. military intelligence gathering because they were totally surprised by the Japanese. And so it was set up in about 1941. And then at the end of the war, the OSS was disbanded. And then 2 years later, the personnel were rolled over into the CIA, which was created in September 1947 through the National Security Act. Basically the same people who had been in the OSS. And the OSS did various kinds of drug research and mind control research, including with hallucinogens and so on, and marijuana and sodium amytal and so on, and different types of drugs. Also, they did experiments with hypnosis. And there's then a little bit of a gap before the CIA started up a series of programs in 1951. There was two programs called Artichoke and Bluebird that ran until about 1953, and they were rolled over into MK Ultra, which ran from 1953 to 1964. Then MK Ultra was rolled over into MK Search, which ran up till 1973. And then running concurrently with MK Ultra and MK Search, there was roughly about 10 other programs that are declassified, and there's a little smattering of information on each of those. They have names like MK Naomi and QK Hilltop and MK Delta. By far the best known and the one that I have the most documents on is MK Ultra. Mm-hmm. It involved 149 different separate contracts at about 80 different institutions all around Canada and the United States. And in MK Naomi, MK Ultra, and MK Search, there's basically about three major blocks of types of mind control research. About half the projects in MK Ultra, for instance, were on some sort of procurement of chemicals, supplying chemicals, or manufacturing chemicals, which is mostly hallucinogens, sometimes biological warfare weapons, such as bacteria and viruses, and sometimes other types of chemicals for mind control research. So it was just straight contracting to get the chemicals. An example of that would be in 1953, one of the MK Ultra sub-projects was a $400,000 grant to Eli Lilly, which is the drug company that manufactures Prozac, mm-hmm. and that was for manufacturing LSD. So the first major supplier of LSD in North America was actually Eli Lilly Drug Company.
And there's evidence that the CIA had was responsible for the distribution of this throughout the United States and North America?
Yeah, they used it in actual experiments. And they also turned some of it over to the military through their MK Naomi program. A lot of the Army mind control and drug research was done at Edgware Arsenal, which has been in the news a lot recently because of a lot of sexual assault and rape of female Army personnel there. And it's linked to Fort Detrick and Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, sort of a little bit north of Washington, D.C.
Is this the same military base that the BBC documentary was done about them giving very powerful drugs to U.S. soldiers?
Yeah. It was the major center for all kinds of hallucinogen and other drug research. The main one that's best known is LSD, but actually the Army released a list of about 130 different compounds that it tested in mind control research. And that was released in 1975. So there's at least 130 different drugs and different types of compounds that they admit using on experimental subjects. And they admit to, again in the mid-70s, they admitted to testing LSD on at least 1,500 subjects. So if you just do the arithmetic very roughly, if they gave LSD to 1,500 people and they tested 130 different drugs, that was just the Army, and you figure there's 4 branches of the military in the United States plus the CIA, you're talking about a huge number of people, potentially hundreds of thousands of people who got at least one dose of some experimental mind control drug, usually without any kind of adequate informed consent at all.
Now, who typically would these people be? Where are they drawing their subjects from?
Actually, I'd just like to pop back to talking about Eli Lilly for a second, just to finish off that part of the story, and then I'll answer that question.
Okay.
LSD was discovered accidentally in 1943 by a man named Albert Hoffman working at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland, which is a drug company. And what happened was that in the late 40s, early 50s, a rumor developed that the Russians might try to buy up the entire world supply of LSD. So that's why the CIA decided to contract with the drug company in the United States that manufactures Prozac, which is Eli Lilly, so they could have a secure North American supply. And one of the things that amazed me absolutely the most doing this background research was to find out who the original acid heads were in North America. Because you would assume it'd be beatniks or criminals or musicians or somebody or other. It turns out that the original acid heads in North America were actually the psychiatrists and the CIA and military personnel. And in conferences that were financially sponsored by the CIA that resulted in books, I've got dozens of these psychiatrists who are some of the major drug researchers and major psychiatrists in the second half of the 20th century, all describing the acid trips they were on, how much they enjoyed them, how useful they thought they were, and describing using LSD to treat all kinds of different things, from alcoholism to anxiety to even homosexuality, which they considered to be a disease. So they were themselves turning themselves and each other on, and then they were using all kinds of different subjects. The majority would be either psychiatric patients who are already in treatment, Army personnel, prisoners in several different prisons in the United States, or in one project, which was through MKUltra, they actually had prostitutes that they hired through MKUltra, and they set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York. And the prostitutes would go out on the street and recruit people for tricks. The CIA people would watch the tricks through one-way mirrors and monitor the sex, and the prostitutes would slip the Johns LSD and other hallucinogens. And these people were totally unaware that they were involved in any kind of government experiment, totally unaware that they were going to get LSD at all, gave no consent whatsoever. So most of the time the subjects were somebody who was one notch down in the power setup. They were either an employee of the institution where the doctor was doing the research, they were a patient, they were somebody in the military who, loosely speaking, volunteered but really didn't have much choice, or they were prisoners. So usually it was somebody who was under the control of the administration and under the control of the doctor somehow, to some extent.
Now, specifically what prisons were involved in the mind control experiments?
One of the prisons that was the New Jersey Reformatory at Bordentown, which is in Pennsylvania. The investigator there was Carl Pfeiffer, who had a lot of MKUltra and MK Search money. He was also, besides being at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Research Institute, which is where he did the work at Bordentown, he was the chairman of the Department of Pharmacology at one of the major universities in Atlanta, Emory University. And while he was there, he did LSD experiments on people in the Atlanta penitentiary. There was the narcotics farm in Lexington, Kentucky, which was a prison that was mainly for drug-related offenders. And then one of the more sinister ones is Vacaville State Prison in California. Mm-hmm. Vacaville State Prison was an MK search site where they did drug research related to the drug Pemeline, which is called Cylert. The trade name is Cylert. It's used for attention deficit disorder in kids. They were using it to study memory enhancement through drugs. And that was at the same time as Donald DeFreeze was an inmate at Vacaville. Donald DeFreeze was the head of the
SLA
Liberation Army that captured Patty Hearst. At the same time that there was drug research going on at the New Jersey Reformatory at Bordentown, a man was in a prison there whose name was Louis Castillo, and he was later arrested in the Philippines on suspicion of being there to assassinate Ferdinand Marcos. And he exhibited 5 distinct personalities on 40 different interviews conducted by the Philippines FBI. There was consultation from the Philippines FBI to the American FBI in his case. Also, because he alleged that he was involved in the Kennedy assassination, there was a consultation with Gerald Ford, who was on the Warren Commission. So all of this is sort of tied into all kinds of aspects of the whole second half of the 20th century. It's a very, very twisted, convoluted history. The people who were the expert witnesses for Patty Hearst, who were saying that she had been captured by the Symbionese Liberation Army and brainwashed by them using the mind control techniques of destructive cults, which are very similar to the mind control techniques of the CIA and military mind control. Those witnesses included Robert Lifton, Margaret Singer, Martin Orne, and a psychiatrist named Jolly West. And Jolly West and Martin Orne had top secret clearance and had MK Ultra money. Their testimony about Patty Hearst was that a new identity named Tanya had been created through these brainwashing techniques. And Patty Hearst identified herself as Tanya when she robbed a bank. She was convicted and found guilty and actually sentenced to jail for that. So the experts in a lot of the CIA mind control programming were very aware of the possibility of creating an artificial multiple personality through mind control techniques. And they testified that this had been done by this character, Donald DeFreeze, who was a black criminal who was basically a petty criminal and thief. There's several strange twists to that story. One of the strange twists, which is somewhat documented but not completely documented, is that Donald DeFreeze, according to several different sources, and according to Patty Hearst's biography as well, was actually an employee of the CIA during the Vietnam War. He was a psychological warfare there's not Donald DeFreeze himself, another man named Colston Westbrook, was an employee of the CIA full-time and was a psychological warfare expert in Vietnam. And according to these several different books, he came back and got a job at the University of Berkeley as a language instructor. And then he entered Vacaville Prison under cover of the Black Cultural Association, which was a black prisoners and inmates program. And under cover of that Black Cultural Association, he used mind control techniques on Donald DeFreeze and actually gave him his code name of Sank and designed the 7-headed cobra logo of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Then Donald DeFreeze was transferred from a maximum security facility at namely Vacaville, to a low-security facility from which he immediately escaped, and several months after then captured Patty Hearst and used fairly sophisticated mind control techniques on her and created this Manchurian Candidate second identity bank robber in her named Tanya.
So unless all of this is highly coincidental, what you're saying is that the SLA was a CIA creation? I don't know for a documented fact that that's true, but that's what these several different books are alleging. And the information is fairly detailed, and I'm trying to research up on that. But it's absolutely known for a fact that these two doctors, Dr. West and Dr. Orne,
had extensive funding from all branches of military. And he published off, starting in 1943 and going all the way up to 1971, very, very detailed accounts of creating multiple personality during the Second World War for various branches of the U.S. military. And basically these people were, he called them multiple personality. He talked about the multiple personality literature, and he referred to them as super spies. So the idea is that you create somebody artificially using hypnosis and other mind control techniques who had no multiple personality before, but now has this second identity. And the second identity is hidden behind a memory barrier or amnesia barrier. And there's a verbal access code that's used to call out the second identity. And so now, say the person is a Marine, they'll be given some kind of a courier assignment to take some documents, say, to Tokyo. But G.H. Estabrooks then calls out the second personality and sticks in some classified information into the second personality. Then there's a switch back to the main identity. The person is just going on this routine trip to take some sort of documents or technical materials over to Tokyo. When he gets to the far end, then he uses the example of a Colonel Brown. Colonel Brown in Tokyo then uses the code signal, and the example that he gives in one of the description is that this Colonel Brown says, "The moon is clear." As soon as he says the moon is clear, then the other identity pops out, gives the classified message. Colonel Brown inserts a classified response. Then the person pops back to their regular identity, goes back home and thinks that they've just been on a routine assignment. But Estabrooks again says the moon is clear. The identity comes out, and Estabrooks gets the classified message from this Colonel Brown. So he describes using these people in hypnotic courier missions and for actual operations extensively, many times during the Second World War.
So this is in George Estabrooks' own documentation that he's describing this?
Right. And he also describes using them for infiltration operations. So the idea there is you take somebody who's a loyal, patriotic Marine, and you create in them a new identity of a communist, and you submerge the previous identity of the patriotic Marine. Now this person who's a really diehard communist goes and infiltrates various communist cells or political organizations or does whatever spy work is required. And the idea is if one of these couriers or these infiltration agents is captured and interrogated, they actually have no idea that they're spies. They genuinely think they're either on just a routine mission or they genuinely believe that they're communists. So then they can't be interrogated and they can't be made to reveal information so easily. And then of course, they go in and they do whatever infiltration operation is required, and then they come back and they're debriefed by Estabrooks, who knows how to get through to the original personality. And some of these people are actually, according to Estabrooks, were given dishonorable discharges as part of their cover. Now, one question about that is Estabrooks just telling tall tales? Well, I've been able to build up a lot of documentation about him, and his personal archives are still housed at this Colgate College. I photocopied probably, it would be a pile of paper at least a foot deep.
And what did those documents reveal to you?
Well, it's all his personal papers, correspondence, background. And so I've got actual original documents photocopied now showing that he in fact was employed by the War Department during the Second World War. He marketed his ideas to every branch of military intelligence in the United States. There's tons of correspondence with him from all kinds of Navy, Army, Air Force intelligence people. He did a lot of training at Fort Holabird and other locations. One of the most interesting things about him is that he corresponded pretty regularly with J. Edgar Hoover from the 1930s through into the 1960s. He had a lot of correspondence with J. Edgar Hoover. There was a lot of FBI personnel who came out and visited him, attended his different teachings. And a lot of these people talked about reading his textbook, which came out in 1943, that's called Hypnotism. And in that textbook, he describes these artificial multiple personalities in a lot of detail. I've got good documentation. The CIA in Bluebird and Artichoke did pretty much the same experiments. They describe several different things. They don't describe actual operations, but they describe real-life simulations where they're testing these people. So they describe the same thing that Estabrook is talking about, where they hypnotize somebody and condition them and create a second identity that can stand up onto a lie detector test. Also, they describe creating amnesia barriers and having people go on assignments where they go into another building and rifle through some materials and take some documents and bring them back, and then have no memory of doing that whatsoever. And in MK Ultra, there was a contractor named Alden Sears who did experiments at the University of Minnesota and the University of Denver, which were very similar. And there's a lot of documentation of him procuring CIA safe houses for some of his experiments, coming and doing demonstrations of these kind of techniques for military and CIA personnel, and creating hypnotic couriers and so on. So there's several sets of documents that back up that this was done at an experimental level by the CIA successfully, but I don't have documents about their use in operations.
Now, you mentioned that there were three areas of interest in the mind control experimentation. I wonder if we could just review those again. You mentioned drugs.
The big chunk was just manufacturing and supplying drugs, chemicals, and biological weapons. Another large chunk was actually using the drugs in experiments on people to try and create amnesia, to create altered states of consciousness, to test the drugs for interrogation purposes, and also to test them for detecting hypnotically programmed agents. There was a team called the Artichoke team that was created as part of Project Artichoke that would use different chemical and mind control, sensory deprivation techniques to try and figure out if somebody had been hypnotically programmed by another intelligence agency. In other words, they were trying to pick up these hypnotically controlled double agents that had been created either by the KGB or whoever. Then about a quarter of the research projects were just kind of odds and ends of all different types, different psychology and sociology experiments. A man named R. Gordon Wasson, who wrote a book called Soma, the Divine Mushroom of Immortality, which is about that toadstool that you always see in fairy tales, which has got a white stalk and a red cap with white flecks on it. That's mushroom Amanita muscaria. It's a hallucinogen that was used by circumpolar shamans in both northern Canada, Alaska, and Siberia for centuries. So this R. Gordon Wasson, who called this mushroom Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, he had an MK Ultra grant through J.P. Morgan Company to go on an expedition to northern Mexico to try and find hallucinogenic mushrooms. And just to give you an example of how all these things kind of tie into our culture at large, G.H. Estabrooks gave 3 or 4 major symposia that he set up at Colgate College, and he invited all kinds of people to them, which included Martin Orne. And actually 2 of the different conferences or symposia that he put on, Aldous Huxley came and talked. And Aldous Huxley used hallucinogens himself and wrote the novel The Brave New World. In The Brave New World, which is a science fiction book, the government controls the people by giving them a mind control drug called Soma. So all these things are kind of very strangely interconnected with each other. Mm-hmm. Not as part of a huge conspiracy, but just because all these people knew each other, talked to each other, influenced and affected each other. Mm-hmm. One of the purposes of a lot of the sub-projects, 4 of the MK Ultra sub-projects were on children. And 3 of those investigators did not know it was CIA money, and 1 did know it was CIA money. But the research projects themselves were pretty bland and not very alarming. And so the purpose there, as stated by the CIA, is not really the research as such. One of them, MK Ultra Subproject 103, was at the Children's International Summer Camp in Maine. And it was a camp basically where children from all kinds of different countries would come and spend weeks or a summer. And the purpose of the research was to study how children communicate and solve problems when they don't share a common language. But the purpose of the CIA funding, which was secret, was that they wanted to establish contact with a whole bunch of foreign national children who were as young as 11 years old, because they might be of potential intelligence use in the future. In other words, they were just interested in getting an in so they could make a list of people and start figuring out who might be a good person to recruit for whatever CIA purpose in the future. And they were doing this with really just children.
Now, you mentioned that multiple personalities are much more easily created within children, and if the military and CIA's goals were to use multiple personalities for intelligence purposes, is there evidence of experimentation on children?
Not experimentation to create multiple personality directly, but there's experiments on children that you would think were totally unbelievable, impossible, could never happen. And if you heard somebody telling you about them, you'd just think the person was making it up or was deluded. But actually, I have the publications that describe the research. One thing is that G.H. Estabrooks himself did some kind of hypnosis experiments on children at 2 different orphanages in northern New York. So he did create multiple personality experimentally. He did correspond with J. Edgar Hoover about using hypnosis and drugs on juvenile offenders, and he did actually do some kind of research at these 2 orphanages, but I don't know the exact nature of the research, except that it involved hypnosis in some form. But if you think this is too much to believe, there's no way that the CIA, the military, would do experiments to create multiple personality in children. That's just too off the wall and too bizarre. It'd be helpful if you know what actually is documented and what actually was done. And one of the most revered psychiatrists who had her obituary in the American Journal of Psychiatry recently is a woman named Loretta Bender. She was a child psychiatrist, and you could interview any child psychiatrist around the country, and he would speak in glowing terms about her contribution to child psychiatry. In a publication that I have on file that I photocopied, that you can just get at the medical school library, it's not hard to get, she describes giving LSD in dosages of 150 micrograms, which is a big street-level dose for a kid, to children aged 5 to 10 for days, weeks, and sometimes months in a row. She also described giving hallucinogenic doses of psilocybin, which is the main compound in magic mushrooms, to kids as young as 5 years of age. So this network of doctors whose drugs were supplied either by the CIA or the military or by drug companies funded by the CIA and the military gave massive doses of LSD and other hallucinogens to kids 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And they would keep them on full acid trips up to months in a row.
And this was documented in the journals at the time?
Yeah, it was published in the regular medical journals. You can just go to the library and photocopy it.
And there was no outcry in the profession against this? I mean, this sounds like torture.
No, it was just regarded as psychiatrists doing research and trying to help kids. That's the thing that's the most amazing about all of this is you don't have to have a conspiracy theory, and really conspiracy theories are interesting, but kind of beside the point, I think. The thing that's most amazing is that all this kind of stuff is just straightforward, everyday, regular activity of psychiatrists and psychologists. It gets published, it gets presented at conferences, and nobody comments on it or gets outraged about it or does anything about it.
Incredible.
Another type of research that's fully documented, and again, if you know the references, any medical school library has these references on file and you can go and photocopy them. There's a whole body of research on brain electrode implants. The main people who were doing that were this Jolly West tried to set up a program in Los Angeles to do that, which was approved by Ronald Reagan, but then got shut down by public protest. The main work was done at Tulane University in New Orleans by Robert Heath, at Yale by Jose Delgado, and at Harvard by a team that included Frank Irvin and William Sweet. So these are the major universities in the Western world. What they basically did was they would stick very fine electrodes into a human being's brain, often up to 15, 20, 25 electrodes at one time. And they would stick them in specific centers in the brain or specific areas in the brain, and then they would stimulate the electrodes electrically through wires, and that would cause the electrode to discharge, which would cause that part of the brain to fire. And then Jose Delgado at Yale made a technical advance, which was he invented a remote transmitter box that in the 1960s had a range of up to 100 feet. So he could push a button on the box that would transmit a signal to the electrode. There'd be a firing of the electrode, and that part of the brain would then get activated. And in the books and the papers that are published, he describes also doing this in cats and in monkeys, and he refers to these monkeys as mechanical toys because he could control their body movements and control their behavior. An example of what he did with monkeys was he had a group of monkeys who are all in the same species living in a large cage, and they have a dominance hierarchy. That is, they have a boss monkey who runs the whole show, and then they have a whole bunch of submissive males and females. And in the normal setup, the boss monkey has half the cage to himself, and all the other monkeys get to use the other half. And if they try and come in his space, then he gets mad or gets angry or beats them up or threatens them or whatever. And this is just the sort of normal social structure of these monkey troops. What he did then was he implanted an electrode in the brain of the boss monkey, and when he pushed a certain button on his transmitter box, the boss monkey became completely passive. And so the other monkeys started to figure this out and would start getting bold and would come into his part of the cage and would rough him up and not pay attention to him. And so the next step in the experiments was he put a lever in the actual cage that the different monkeys could get their hands on. They could press the lever. When they pressed the lever, it then transmitted a signal to the electrode in the boss monkey's brain, making him be passive. So the other monkeys learned this. So the other monkeys started practicing mind control on the boss monkey by pressing the lever to make him have these seizures in this part of the brain that made him passive. And they actually learned how to control the boss monkey, and it shows a picture of the other monkeys all over the cage and not paying any attention to the boss monkey at all. What he did then was he did this in human beings, including children. And he describes an 11-year-old boy that he put brain electrodes in, and when he pressed the right button on the box, the boy would start talking about maybe being a girl and would start talking about wanting to marry a male therapist. So they were using brain electrode implants to modify the identity and the worldview and the behavior of children as young as 11.
Incredible.
Robert Heath, who did the same sort of stuff at Tulane University, he actually describes the same case in several different publications. And the guy's referred to as subject B19. And he was, I forget if he was 18 or 20. He was in around 18, 20, maybe 19. He was a homosexual guy, and they viewed homosexuality as a medical disease which needed to be treated. So they put brain electrodes in this guy, one of which went into the area of the brain called the septum, which was one of the pleasure centers of the brain. And then they would push the button, which would cause the electrode to fire, and he would not have, not have a full orgasm, but would be sort of 3/4 of the way to orgasm, feeling really, really good as a result of the button being pushed. And they kind of studied that and practiced it, and while they were pushing the box, they would get him to watch heterosexual pornography films so that he would be experiencing a near orgasm while he's watching heterosexual pornography. They were trying to switch him over to being interested in women. And then they did two further things. They set him up with a little box of his own where he could push the button on the box himself. And they have a chart of different 3-hour periods, and they show how many times he pushed the button himself. He, in one 3-hour period, got up to pushing the button 1,500 times to give himself an artificial near orgasm. And then the final step they did in the research was they brought in a 20-year-old prostitute, this is to the medical school, and had her have sex with him. And while they were having sex, they recorded the brain electrode outputs because it was a two-way communication system. They could send a signal to the guy's brain to fire off that part of the brain, or they could just use the electrodes to monitor the brain activity that was going on naturally. So they actually took brain electrode activity recordings from deep inside his brain while he was having an orgasm with this female prostitute. And then they report that over an 11-month period of follow-up, he was mostly heterosexual with a few relapses. So this is just the stuff that really went on. A guy at Harvard who was part of the Harvard brain electrode team, his name was William Sweet. He was testifying at the recent hearings, and there was a committee set up by Bill Clinton to look into all the radiation experiments. The radiation experiments are all intertwined and overlap with all this mind control stuff. And William Sweet, who was part of the brain electrode team at Harvard, described injecting plutonium into people at Harvard as part of Atomic Energy Commission, military, and CIA radiation research. And he claimed that all of the subjects there gave informed consent. But one of the subjects, who was named HP-12, I think HP was initials for human product, so they referred to their experimental subjects as human product, and then they would have a series of numbers. So this guy was HP-12. He arrived at the emergency department at one of the Boston hospitals, which was part of the Harvard system, unconscious and unidentified. He was injected with plutonium, obviously without giving informed consent, and he died without regaining consciousness and without being identified. So that didn't quite fit with the idea that everybody gave informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
And recently the Clinton government approved a settlement of $4.8 million for just 12 of these plutonium subjects. There's probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them.
And this was the outcome of the presidential hearing on radiation experiments.
So what I think, and what I'm going to start lobbying for, is that there should be another hearing on the mind control side of things.
Right. And the mind control experiments were introduced at the end of the hearings. Can you talk about that? What evidence was introduced and what the response was by the U.S. government?
There was a number of different people. It was a typical kind of presidential commission, which is like the various commissions of inquiry that go on in Canada, where they receive all kinds of mail and correspondence, and then they go around the country having hearings that anybody can testify at. And they had hearings in Washington that people went down to. So there's a number of people who testified about two aspects of this: the documented stuff, like I've been describing, and then the memories of individual patients of stuff that they claim has gone on, which isn't documented. So the things that I know for sure went on, and includes went on in Canada, were use of hallucinogens, implantation of these brain electrodes, massive uses of electric shock, and that's electric shock is an ECT treatment to make you have a seizure, and also just electric shock to different parts of your body as part of behavior modification. Sensory deprivation experiments where people were kept in chambers for long periods of time until they started hallucinating. Ewan Cameron, who's the best-known CIA contractor in Cameron, did what's called psychic driving, where he would make people listen to tape loops for literally hours and hours and hours and hours and hours per day with repeated messages trying to modify their way of thinking. So all of these different elements have been used, absolutely, totally documented in stuff that's published in medical school library-type journals.
Mm-hmm.
One of my sort of favorite and most bizarre series of experiments like that was done at the University of Minnesota by a man named Amadeo Marazzi, who had an Air Force grant for LSD research while at the University of Minnesota. And previous to that, he was one of the sort of administrative managerial guys at Edgware Arsenal for their mind control research. He, besides just giving people LSD and so on, he made use of what's called the Ames Leaf Room. That's AMES. A guy named Ames developed this room, funded by the Office of Naval Research, which is heavily involved in all this mind control research. The Ames Leaf Room has different forms. It can either be a room that's usually built out of plywood that's got walls that are at all kinds of weird angles, or this particular room was cubic. So it was just a normal-shaped kind of cube, and you would sit inside the room. One side would have no wall at all, it would be open, and that's the side that you would be looking into, and you would be sitting just inside the room so that you couldn't see anything except the walls. And then the entire room was lined with leaves, so leaves were glued to all the walls. So there you are in this sort of environment where you can't exactly see where the corners are because of all these leaves. And then when you're in the Ames Leaf Room, either in the research by Ames or this guy at University of Minnesota, you would put on special glasses called anisoconic lenses. And the anisoconic lenses would distort all of the angles. So like the ceiling would be sort of coming down at you. The floor would be slanting some other weird angle. One wall would be coming in at you and the other wall going away. The leaves on one side of the room would be all big and coming out at you, and the leaves on the other side would be kind of flat and receding. And all of the different perspectives didn't fit together properly. And then the subject who's sitting in there looking through these anisoconic lenses has a little control mechanism to control a bar that's at the far end of the room to try and set it to horizontal. And it shows a photograph of this guy sitting in there, and the bar is like at a 40-degree angle, but he thinks it's horizontal. And then the extra twist that Morazzi did was, while he had these people sitting in the Ames Leaf room with these weird goggles on, he gave them LSD. And that's all done on Air Force contracts. So this is pretty weird and bizarre stuff.
Yeah. What, if any, was the U.S. government's response to the test, specifically the mind control experimentation testimony at the hearings on radiation?
They just kind of acknowledged it and really didn't comment or do much of anything with it.
So nothing has been done to follow up?
Nothing systematic that I'm aware of, no.
Right. I just want to go back to when you were talking about brain implants. Have you or other therapists come across direct evidence of implants in clients?
Nothing real conclusive. There's kind of a conspiracy literature about that exists that you can see find on the internet and find in various publications and so on, where people will show X-rays, and there always is somewhere in the X-ray what's supposed to be an implant, but it's kind of vague usually and not really absolutely documented. I don't think that's because it's not going on. I think it's just because the documentation hasn't been fished out yet. So I haven't myself had a patient who comes in for treatment and I've been able to document that there's implants in this person's brain.
So the documented evidence indicates that they're able to use implants for control purposes and also to receive information from a person's brain. Is that correct?
Guy Jolly West, who is the expert witness for Patty Hearst, who is also the military and CIA contractor, who's an expert on multiple personality and different things. He actually mentions multiple personality in his CIA MKUltra proposal. He tried to set up this UCLA Violence Center that was going to be funded by Ronald Reagan, and Frank Irvin from the Harvard brain electrode implant team was going to come. And one of the things that was going to be done at the UCLA Violence Project and also was going to be done at Vacaville State Prison under separate administrative structure, but which got shut down by public protest, was they were going to implant brain electrodes in violent sex offenders, and then they were going to do two things. They were going to use the electrodes as kind of like an electronic bracelet inside the person's head. So they were going to monitor the person's location because of transmissions from the implanted electrodes, and then they would know if the person had gone out. This is after their discharge from prison. They would know if the person had gone outside their restricted area. Also, they would be able to monitor the person's level of sexual arousal through the brain electrodes. So if the guy was outside his restricted area and was starting to get sexually aroused, what they would do would be then transmit a signal to him that would just paralyze him. And one of the things that was going to be done at the UCLA Violence Project and also was going to be done at Vacaville State Prison under separate administrative structure, but which got shut down by public protest, was they were going to implant brain electrodes in violent sex offenders, and then they were going to do two things. They were going to use the electrodes as kind of like an electronic bracelet inside the person's head. So they were going to monitor the person's location because of transmissions from the implanted electrodes, and then they would know if the person had gone out. This is after their discharge from prison. They would know if the person had gone outside their restricted area. Also, they would be able to monitor the person's level of sexual arousal through the brain electrodes. So if the guy was outside his restricted area and was starting to get sexually aroused, what they would do would be then transmit a signal to him that would just paralyze him. Just make him like go catatonic or stop in his tracks and not move. And then they would notify the police who would go pick him up. And there's a book called Violence in the Brain by two of these Harvard brain electrode people, and they discuss maybe using these kind of electrodes to deal with people who are rioting, like the Watts riots and so on that were going on at that time. So there was a whole scheme about how we were going to control bad people in the population that we didn't like.
And this is their own literature and their own documentation that you're getting this information from?
This is all completely published, objective, real, exists type stuff.
And does it go into detail about how the electronic delivery mechanism, is it by satellite or by some kind of radio that they would receive and send signals?
Yes, I don't know a whole lot about the technical side of it, but it was, this is back in the 60s and 70s, so they wouldn't have been doing satellite uplinks on that at that point yet. It would be some sort of line-of-sight radio beam of some kind. Another thing that also is documented, there's a journal called Defense Electronics in the July 1993 issue. There's a one-page article there that describes technology that's under development. There's a Russian guy who specializes in this stuff. His name is Igor Smirnov. It's basically technology for beaming different forms of radiation at people's heads. And there's about 4 or 5 MK Ultra projects that were on this kind of stuff. So it can be either sound energy, sound percussion waves, or different types of light and radio frequency and all kinds of different types of energy. So the Igor Smirnov is a specialist in this kind of stuff who has technology that he's developed. He was brought over in March of 1993 to a meeting in Northern Virginia that was attended by the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. I think I remember the list right. One of these might be wrong, but definitely the CIA, definitely the FBI. I think the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I think the National Security Agency, a representative from General Electronics and a representative from one of the universities, who all got together to discuss the possibility of using this technology on David Koresh. And this was during the Branch Davidian siege. And according to the article, the reason they decided not to use this technology on him was problems with software compatibility between the Russian software and the American hardware. And what happened as an upshot at the meeting was that a firm called Psycho Technologies that's based in Virginia, I forget which town in Virginia, actually contracted with the Russians to develop this kind of technology for possible American usage. So that's all stuff that's actually real, that's actually going on, that's undergoing some sort of research and development currently. In the MK Ultra projects, they also describe implanting brain electrodes in various kinds of animals, including dolphins, and using them as delivery systems for biological and chemical weapons. So that's actually in the CIA materials, and they describe further research to fine-tune those kind of systems that were already in successful operational use.
Do you have evidence of DIA involvement in the mind control experiments? Have you been able to get any DIA documentation?
For listeners that don't know, the DIA is the Defense Intelligence Agency.
I understand the DIA is something like 10 times the size of the CIA as well?
Actually, the CIA, the director of the CIA controls only about 10% of the financial assets of the American intelligence community, meaning that the CIA is really a tiny fragment of all of military and civilian intelligence in the United States. The National Security Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency are both quite a bit bigger. The answer to your question is yes and no. The no part is I don't have direct documentation of Defense Intelligence Agency mind control contracts. But it's really kind of beside the point because all of these intelligence agencies are all interconnected with each other.
Right.
For instance, the CIA had 2 programs, MK Ultra and MK Naomi, and they got federal funds, which they then put into MK Naomi, and MK Naomi then funded the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick and Edgewater Arsenal to do mind control research. So, and that's the way it is with the radiation experiments, too. The Atomic Energy Commission, Health, Education, Welfare, the CIA, all kinds of different government agencies are all interlinked and interconnected. One of the Defense Intelligence Agency programs was called Stargate. There was a liaison between the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency on that. It was just declassified about roughly within the last year. And there was program on in December on ABC TV, ABC's Nightline program in December, where Bill Gates, who was a former head of the CIA, one of the guys who was the CIA person who was responsible for liaison between the CIA and the military on Stargate, and one of the guys who was a Stargate contractor, all talking about Stargate, which they admitted ran up until at least 1984 and had funding of at least $20 million, which is probably just the tip of the iceberg. And Stargate was a remote viewing program. So the intelligence agencies, all in an interconnected fashion, spent millions of dollars on remote viewing, which is basically having psychics lie down on a table and try and see what's going on at some location in a foreign country to gather intelligence information. There's a book that was just published by Michael Joseph, I think it is, which is a branch of Penguin, a British branch of Penguin Books, called Psychic Warrior, where a guy describes being one of these remote viewers. A lot of that work was done at the Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto, California. So I mention that partly because it's interesting, partly because if you think that creating multiple personality disorder is too bizarre and strange to be real, again, you have to look at this LSD, this brain electrode research, some of the sensory deprivation, that Ames leaf room with those anisoconic lenses, using millions and millions and millions of dollars to pay psychics to spy on other countries while lying on tables in the United States. Once you have that context, then creating multiple personality just seems kind of small.
Now, what is, like, I understand that what's driving this was the Cold War, back
right.
From the information that we've got back from the late 50s.
True and not true.
Right, but...
Let me explain why it's true and not true.
Okay.
Just briefly. That's actually a disinformation setup. The term brainwashing was invented by a man named Edward Hunter, who wrote a book about brainwashing in the early 1950s that I have a copy of. So he invented that term and described how the American pilots and prisoners of war in the Korean War, who were captured by the Chinese and then were made to sign false germ warfare confessions and were converted to being communists, had been brainwashed. And then the whole idea was that the CIA and other intelligence agencies had to figure out how that happened. And Jolly West, Margaret Singer, and Robert Lifton, who testified at the Patty Hearst trial, they all interviewed these returning prisoners of war in the Korean War and became experts on mind control and cult thought reform techniques and so on. So the idea was that because the communists were doing that, we had to figure out how to combat that. So it was mainly defensive, and it was reactive to what the communist Chinese were doing. But that's not true, because G.H. Estabrook was already doing that stuff in the Second World War, way before the Korean War. So actually there was an offensive program of mind control by the OSS and other intelligence agencies 10 years before the Korean War. So the whole idea that it got started because of the Cold War is disinformation. But then it obviously got fueled and entrenched by the Cold War. And then the question becomes, well, the Cold War is over. Why do we need that stuff anymore? Right. And I think the answer is severalfold. One is, we in fact do need to have intelligence agencies. The world is not a safe place, and for us not to be living in Siberia and getting sent to labor camps in Siberia, we've got to protect ourselves from all kinds of forces in the world, and to do that we have to have intelligence agencies. So I have no beef with the CIA as such or the existence of intelligence agencies. I think they're essential to maintaining freedom and democracy. But once you've got intelligence agencies, you've got the military and you've got a bunch of budgets, you've got people who, like any federal bureaucrats, have to justify their budgets and their programs and everything. You've got people who are already into this, and you've got actual applications of it, and so it'll just carry on, I think, indefinitely. And the fact that the Cold War is over, I don't see as being a major item in this stuff stopping.
Now, you mentioned in your previous lecture that you, as you said, you don't blame the CIA per se, but the psychiatrists and doctors that are involved in this. Do you not feel that the CIA holds some responsibility in funding and allowing the doctors and psychiatrists to operate?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Like these people definitely were, the victims of all of this, definitely did not give informed consent. definitely was unethical. It was harmful. There was damages. They deserve compensation, and the federal government's on the hook for that. And so the idea is not that I'm sort of soft on the CIA or apologetic for them. It's just that I'm basically a psychiatrist, right? So my number one concern is with all this bizarre, unethical, destructive conduct by my colleagues and the medical ethics of it and getting the medical profession under control. So what I think needs to happen is that it should no longer be allowed that psychiatrists, psychologists, doctors have funding from the CIA or the military without the subjects of the research knowing where the money is coming from and knowing that it's not really medical research as such. It's military intelligence, warfare, psychological warfare, mind control research.
In some of the literature, seems to suggest that Canada was offered up to supply so-called guinea pigs for the U.S. mind control experiments. I'm particularly referring to the Allen Memorial at McGill University in Montreal with Dr. Cameron. What do you think has Canada's role been in the U.S. military mind control experiments?
Well, the Canadian Psychiatric Association has put out some disinformation that's been pretty well bought by the Canadian public, and that is that Ewan Cameron, it was just an isolated incident, happened a long time ago back in the 50s, that he had CIA funding. There were sort of different ethical standards back then. Of course, we wouldn't approve it now, but it was just a one-time deal, and he was such a great man we can overlook it. Well, that's not true, because that research completely violated the ethical standards of the time. But also, it wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, Ewan Cameron wasn't even the only person at McGill at that time with CIA funding. Dr. Raymond Prince was funded through MKUltra Subproject 121 to do anthropological psychiatry research in Nigeria. He didn't know at the time it was CIA money. Donald Hebb, who was the chairman of the Department of Psychology there, did a lot of sensory deprivation experiments funded by Canada's Defense Research Board. When the CIA stopped funding Ewan Cameron's work, Health, Education, and Welfare Canada just picked it up and continued this incredibly unethical, harmful, destructive research that wiped out people's memories for their whole lives. There's a man named Hassan Azima, who was a psychiatrist who died of cancer in his early 40s, who was being groomed to be a mind control researcher who was doing LSD and sensory deprivation experiments at McGill, and who was presenting at conferences where all these other military and CIA-funded people were at. So he was in the loop. James Tyhurst, who in 1951 was part of a committee meeting to oversee Bluebird and Artichoke in Canada before Ewan Cameron got his money, was also funded by Canada's Defense Research Board, and he did LSD research also at Hollywood Hospital in Vancouver. And a doctor named Ross McLean, who was the director at Hollywood Hospital in Vancouver, attended a CIA-sponsored LSD symposium and described giving LSD to 338 different patients at Hollywood Hospital. So there was a lot of military LSD flowing into Vancouver. Then Abram Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond did a lot of military LSD research in Saskatchewan. And Humphrey Osmond then left and moved down to the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute in Pennsylvania, where Carl Pfeiffer was, which is where the Louis Castillo guy was, who was over in the Philippines and got arrested by the FBI over there. So there's been a lot of connections with Canadian psychiatry. A spin-off of all of that, some of the research is funded by the military or the CIA or whoever, and then that gets published and presented at conferences and talked about, and then other civilian psychiatrists who aren't directly funded by the CIA start doing the same kind of stuff. An example of that was at Penetanguishene Hospital, which is up on Lake Huron there, where there's basically a heavy-duty facility for people who are criminally insane, not guilty by reason of insanity, unfit to stand trial. In the years about 1968-69, there's 4 papers published in the Canadian Psychiatric Association Journal, which you can go to any of the medical school libraries in Canada and just pull it off the shelf and read it. This psychiatrist named Elliot Barker, who's still alive, was working there. He invented a little room called the capsule that was about 8 by 10 feet. He would put prisoners as young as 15, going up into early 30s, in this capsule in groups of either 2 up to 7 at a time for periods of days up to 11 days at a time, all naked and often on LSD. So there's all these violent offenders, murderers, arsonists, rapists, and so on, and he would have them in this little small capsule, all naked, on LSD, kind of doing rap sessions and therapy groups with each other. And the room would be monitored by other prisoners through the either video link or camera link or through a mirror in the ceiling. And other prisoners were responsible for supplying them food and so on. There was one toilet inside the capsule, and they would be signaled to change from one kind of therapy group to another by changing the color of the light that was shone into the room. So they were in this kind of group sensory deprivation with changing colored lights. And the idea was that this would get through their defenses and they'd get to the real stuff and do real therapy. One of the co-authors on one of these patients is an H.M. Mason, who's at the bottom of the paper. It says that he was a patient at this Oak Ridge facility in Penetang on a ward called F Ward. A documentary was made about it by the CBC. Actually, I have a copy of a video of it. So this H.M. Mason is both one of these patients who are all murderers and arsonists and rapists and so on, who's in this capsule getting LSD, and he's also a co-author on the paper. And then apparently several of the former inmates lived with Elliot Barker post-discharge, and this H.M. Mason, as far as I can tell, is the same guy as Hank Mason. Hank Mason is on the webpage of the Canadian Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which is just what it says. It's Canadian Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. The current president is Elliot Barker, and this Hank Mason has got who's identified as a founding member of the society, has a little statement about child abuse on the webpage. So it would appear that the Canadian Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children has had executive members who are former violent criminals in a facility for the criminally insane, and currently being run by psychiatrists who did all this kind of research, who published it in the Canadian Psychiatric Association Journal.
Interesting.
Just the kind of stuff that it goes on and on and on and on and on with more stories like this.
What's your sense of how many Canadian centers and doctors that were involved in the experimentations?
Well, absolute minimum of 5 to 10.
The centers or
doctors and centers. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, for sure there was McGill, Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and the University of Saskatchewan, Hollywood Hospital, another hospital in Montreal where LSD was, which I forget if it was Montreal General. I think it was Montreal General, but I'm not sure about that. I have it documented somewhere. And the same kind of stuff, apparently not funded by the military or intelligence community, was going on at Penetang.
Is there any indication that experiments were being done on military bases themselves?
Not documented evidence, but there's quite a few accounts from patients that are unverified.
Right. You mentioned that some of the doctors that were involved in this research were unwitting. What kind of funding institutes were set up to fund this kind of research to unwitting doctors? Well,
they used what they called cutouts. A cutout is a front funding organization. The three major ones were the Human Ecology Foundation, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, and the Geschichter Medical Fund.
So each of these would be funded from the CIA, and then in turn they would fund
Right,
CIA
and the people
projects.
who were running those organizations knew that it was CIA money, and often themselves got grants from the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
One of the guys who was on the board of the Human Ecology Foundation, who reviewed grants for the Human Ecology Foundation, and himself got an MKUltra grant and had top secret clearance, was Carl Rogers. That's kind of amazing, because Carl Rogers is best known for client-centered therapy, which is a kind of humanistic, valuing the spiritual worth of the client kind of therapy, where you have to have accurate empathy, unconditional positive regard for the person, and genuine empathy. So it's like the stereotype, most humanistic, touchy-feely psychotherapy going, and he was actually top secret cleared and funding secret CIA mind control research.
Now, there's a lot of doctors and some therapists out there that One of the things that some of these people are saying is that it doesn't exist and that it's actually temporal lobe epilepsy. What is temporal lobe epilepsy, and how is it similar to MPD?
Well, temporal lobe epilepsy is just a form of epilepsy that takes place in the temporal lobe of your brain. So there's abnormal electrical discharges that cause you to have a seizure. A typical temporal lobe seizure lasts for 30 to 90 seconds. You may become unconscious or just get a kind of foggy state of consciousness, and you'll usually like fumble at one of your buttons or smack your lips or turn your body in a very kind of mechanistic, over and over, same little motion kind of way. And then you pop out of it after 30 to 90 seconds usually. So temporal lobe epilepsy is completely unrelated to multiple personality disorder. That's just a bogus prejudice, and there's a bunch of research that I and others have done that show that the symptom picture of temporal lobe epilepsy and multiple personality are completely different from each other.
Why would these people be making these claims? What would be, why the confusion?
Because they don't take accurate histories. They're very vague about what they say, and they just look grasping at straws for some way to discredit multiple personality, basically. The more serious criticism is that multiple personality is often unwittingly created by bad therapists. Now, that I agree with, and I've actually testified about that in court, that in cases where I'm testifying for the patient who's suing the therapist, and I'm stating as an expert witness that, yes, this was created by the therapist, and yes, all these memories were false, and yes, it did all this harm.
Now, this is a very complex issue and one that's being hotly debated by the public.
The main thing is that there actually is a whole bunch of science about multiple personality and dissociation. It's not just a matter of belief. There's a big literature now that it has flaws in it and so on, but there's actually a whole bunch of science. It's not just I believe or I don't believe. The curious twist in the logic is that actually I think that all of this documentation that the military and the CIA have been creating experimental multiple personality and using it in operations actually proves that multiple personality is real. It proves two things. One is that unless they're just wasting money, they're not going to bother with the whole exercise unless you actually can create a new identity that actually is hidden behind a real memory barrier. Otherwise, there'd be no point, right?
And that could be used operationally.
Right. So then none of it's actually really, really, really real. It's all illusions inside your mind. There isn't literally another person in there. But nobody in the multiple personality field is saying that it's literally real anyway to start with. But you can create this artificial second identity, and it can actually do stuff that the main part of the person doesn't remember. That has to be true, otherwise there would be no point in creating it for military use. And so that proves two things. One is that it's possible to create multiple personality by mistake in a bad therapy that mimics a lot of the conditions of military mind control or cult mind control. But also, if you have a disorder that can be created deliberately, either be it by the CIA, by a destructive cult, by a therapist who doesn't really know what they're doing, or even by the person themselves, then it's not really a big jump to imagine that it could also happen just naturally and spontaneously as a way of coping with trauma.
Right.
So the very fact that you can create it artificially, to me, indicates that it can be created artificially by mistake or on purpose, and also that it's likely to happen naturally.
Well, the other question is how they managed to create it artificially. Is it a traumatic...
I'm writing about all of this now. I have a number of case histories that describe it in quite a lot of detail. There's a lot of information about how they created Tanya in Pattyhurst. It's very detailed. There's a very good case from Denmark, a guy named Palle Hardrup, who was in jail in the late 40s in Denmark. Another prisoner named Bjorn Nielsen used a whole lot of mind control and hypnosis techniques and created this amnesic bank robber. And Palle Hardrup actually went out and robbed a bank, and then he robbed another bank, tried to rob a second bank, shot two people, didn't get away with any money, got captured. And the net outcome of the huge trial with 50 witnesses and all kinds of psychiatric testimony and so on, the net outcome of it was that this Bjorn Nielsen guy was found guilty and sentenced to jail, even though he wasn't physically present at any of the robberies. And Palle Hardrup was found kind of an equivalent of not guilty by reason of insanity. And they specifically said at the trial, all the experts did, that this Bjorn Nielsen guy used hypnosis and other methods to create a split identity in Pali-Hardrup. So these kind of cases have actually come to trial, and there's a lot of detail on them.
What would these other methods be, and what would the links be between the methods used for artificially creating multiple personalities and childhood trauma?
Well, the links are severalfold. One is you have to have a pretty good control over the person's life space. You can't just see them for half an hour a week, and that's all that's required. So in the Pali-Hardrup case, these two guys were cellmates, and also they worked in the same workshop, and were basically with each other constantly for about 18 months. If you can isolate the person from the outside world, from contact with other people who are going to be critical of what's going on or give a different point of view, that's helpful. These things apply to destructive cults and also deliberate creation of multiple personality. Then if you can use all kinds of thought reform techniques, that is, getting the person to study doctrine, do all kinds of meditation exercises, chanting exercises, hypnotic focusing exercises, internal dream imagery exercises, you get their mind kind of into a trance state and focused on what you want them to believe and focus on. And then you actually use formal hypnosis or drugs, and then you deliberately instruct them that you want to create a second identity, and then you figure out what is it that this person is going to be motivated by. So in the Pali-Hardrup case, this Bjorn Nielsen guy created Guardian Spirit X, and whenever Bjorn Nielsen was speaking to Pali-Hardrup, it was actually X who was talking through Bjorn Nielsen. And he got Pali-Hardrup to buy into that because he was interested in all kinds of New Age type stuff. And then X started teaching him the path to enlightenment. And so the basic motivator was that he was going to get to enlightenment. And if he didn't follow the doctrine, didn't follow the rules, didn't follow all of the tests, and didn't perform adequately, then he would lose X, and he would lose his path to enlightenment. And that was the thing that he was most obsessed with. So that was the carrot that kept him going. So you have to find some sort of carrot that'll keep the person going. And then you can use any number of different kinds of behavior modification techniques, which could be punishing the person if they say what you don't want them to say, rewarding them if they say what you do want them to say. And I could go on with the list a little bit, but basically you have to get control over the person's thoughts, over their life space, and you have to set up a reward and punishment system to steer them along the path you want so that they become kind of robots who just repeat the doctrine that you want. And then if you want to create the second identity, you can use all kinds of threats, or you can use actual trauma and fear. And the trauma and the fear and the agitation and the upset drive the splitting of the mind just naturally. Because the human mind tends to split or dissociate in some way to cope with trauma all the time.
Right.
Whether it be a plane crash or natural disaster or sexual assault in adulthood. And then the other ingredient with children is that their minds just seem to be more susceptible to this kind of splitting process. The child's mind tends to do that naturally.
You're listening to 88.1. We'll be right back with the second half of this interview with Dr. Colin Ross right after this. Are you familiar with Jennifer Fried's work with her theory of betrayal trauma when it deals with child abuse?
Actually, I wasn't going into all of this here, but the main change in my thinking in terms of how I work with these people clinically over the last 3 years has been shifting much more towards a betrayal trauma type way of looking at things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really directly related to mind control, but yeah, I like her theory a lot and I agree with it.
Right.
The false memory people, Jennifer Fried, for listeners who don't know, is the daughter of Pamela and Peter Fried. Pamela Fried's the executive director of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And the False Memory Syndrome Foundation takes the point of view that multiple personality is pretty bogus, and all these memories that people in therapy are recovering are all false, and it's just a result of basically of mind control techniques by bad therapists. The Scientific Advisory Board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, which is a whole bunch of academics and experts who advise the foundation and sort of speak on behalf of it, include Martin Orne and Jolly West, who had top secret CIA clearance, Harold Leaf, who is the personal psychiatrist to the Frieds, also was a co-author of Robert Heath, who did the brain electrode research at Tulane that was funded by the various branches of the military and the CIA. And there's about 5 of Martin Orn's co-authors, or people that he thanks in publications of his, going back into the 50s, different mind control research that he did, who are also on the board. Margaret Singer, who interviewed these Korean prisoners of war, who had top secret clearance through the military to do that work, is also on the board. And so there's quite a connection and overlap between these False Memory Syndrome Foundation people, not all of them, but a subgroup of them, and all this military mind control research.
Have you had any experiences with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation? I understand they have been fairly aggressive in intimidating therapists throughout North America. Well,
I've had a fair bit of experience with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. I belong to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. I get their newsletter, and I've been talked about and have written in their newsletter. I set up a workshop in Houston where I spoke for a day and a half, and Pamela Fried, the executive director, spoke for half a day. And I've set up about 5 or 6 workshops that I've done with Elizabeth Loftus, who's one of the leading members of the advisory board. I spoke at a meeting that Stephen Ceci was at. He spoke after me, and he commented very favorably on my talk. He's on the advisory board. So I've got a lot of contacts with some of these people, which I consider to be very friendly. I admire their work. I disagree a little bit with some of the things they think, but by and large, I agree with probably over half of what the majority of people on the False Memory Syndrome Advisory Board say. And as I mentioned earlier, I've testified in court basically much the same as any of those people would, that here's an example of really bad therapy that created multiple personality out of nowhere and caused a lot of damage and harm to the person and their family. In the False Memory Syndrome sort of camp, not necessarily the organization itself, but in the kind of camp, there are people who are just real extremists who've gone way overboard, and they're very inflammatory in the way they talk, and everything's all black and white. And the whole multiple personality field is supposed to be totally bad, and all the memories are completely false. And so there's people in that camp who go way overboard. My view on them is that if you sort of set aside some of the really political posturing and the most kind of rabid politics that comes out, and you just listen to kind of the basic message, I agree with it, and I think it's been incredibly helpful to the field, not just dissociative disorders field or sexual trauma therapists, but the entire mental health field. Really, in the 1980s, there was almost zero teaching on how error-prone memory is, and almost no teaching at all about how to think about it, what to do about it, what guidelines we need. All these guidelines about false memories and memory not being reliable really have only come out of the professional organization starting in '94. And the False Memory Syndrome Foundation spearheaded that. So a lot of the work they've done has been incredibly helpful. I agree with it. And it's simply a fact that memory is very unreliable.
Right.
It's just when things get really polarized and everybody's really insulting everybody else and it's a big war, then it becomes ridiculous.
Well, and it seems that the survivors of abuse are again re-victimized by this type of argument where the focus seems to be proving whether a memory was false or not, instead of actually finding out whether abuse did happen or not.
Well, it gets all politicized, and everybody gets very hot under the collar and very defensive about it. Like in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, in the membership, I'm sure that there are a whole bunch of people who actually are falsely accused. But I'm sure there's also a whole bunch of people who are accurately accused and are just trying to run a little scam and say it's false memories.
Right.
But that needs to be set aside if you're trying to look at sort of scientifically what are the issues about memory and what's the best way to do therapy and how do you have to kind of balance things to have therapy that's hopefully more beneficial than more harmful. If people would get off all of the ugly politics and have more of a sort of rational, calm, scientific discussion, it'd be much better. And then, then they wouldn't hear the therapist saying that the false memory people are all just pedophiles, and you wouldn't hear the false memory people saying that the therapists are all insane.
Now, in your opinion, how has the false memory debate affected therapy resources available for survivors in a general sense?
Well, it's affected negatively, basically, because a lot of the therapists have got real paranoid. And there's a lot of agitation in insurance companies and the managed care companies in the United States about this kind of therapy now. The idea that most of the memories are false really is just the basic standard position of psychiatry through the whole 20th century. It's nothing new.
How do you feel that the debate has affected how therapists deal with their clients?
Well, I think it's been beneficial and harmful at the same time. It's been beneficial because therapists have had to kind of get their act together a little bit and be more aware that memory is extremely vague and unreliable and that you can't take everything at face value. And then I've written at great length about strategically how to plan the therapy so that you do the same thing no matter what percentage of the memory is true or false. Most of the time you don't know for a fact. So it's been very helpful in that way. And then it's been harmful in that it's just given an excuse to all kinds of people who don't want to deal with abuse anyway to say, oh, it's all false memories. And it's made the therapist defensive, and it's taken a lot of time and energy away from treatment onto worrying about whether you're going to get sued or not. But you can't, they're sort of opposite sides of the same coin. You can't have therapists finally getting the message that they have to be more careful without also having therapists who are more paranoid about getting sued.
For the benefit of other therapists that might be listening, is there a way to recognize signs of possible mind control experimentation? Are there signs that come up again and again in survivor accounts?
You mean actual military or intelligence agency mind control?
Right.
Or because mind control can be done informally and unwittingly by just the pedophile father at home, or it can be done by any one of the known destructive cults, or it can be done as part of a military research program. So it depends which level you're talking about.
I'm speaking, specifically of the government-funded experiments.
No, there's no kind of, if the person comes in with a sore left elbow, that's a sure sign. There's no kind of sign or symptom like that that's going to automatically clue you off. But there's probably going to be some sort of dissociative disorder. And it's not so much that you go after it as the person starts giving you memories of, it wasn't some stereotype satanic thing out in the woods. They start actually telling you something that sounds like medical research of some kind, experiments of some kind. It's either at a university, it's in a hospital, it's on a military base. So I don't think it really is a bad plan to specifically start asking questions. You have to just wait for the person to start describing that kind of stuff. And then if they start describing that kind of stuff, you just follow normal kind of therapy procedures where you just say, could you tell me a little bit more about that, or I don't quite understand this, or could you clarify that, or what does that mean to you? Why is that important to you? How is that affecting you now? How does that tie into the problems that we're working on now? Mm-hmm. So you really just handle it using basic, sensible therapy techniques that you would. And there's not a special set of strategies or techniques for mind control as such. And these people basically are human beings who've been hurt and have problems. And you need to use the same basic methods of therapy you would otherwise. So, my personal conclusion is that probably the majority, not almost for sure, the vast majority of the satanic ritual abuse memories that I've heard, which involves hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of babies being sacrificed, vast majority of that can't actually be real. Some of it could be. But the techniques that I use and the strategies used in therapy for people who have those satanic ritual abuse memories are really pretty much identical to the same strategies for somebody who doesn't have those kind of memories. And the same applies to the military mind control people, the way I go at it. I use the same basic strategies, principles, and techniques. And I don't really focus on the memories as the main problem.
Mm-hmm. In your opinion, do you think there is any links between the accounts of ritual abuse and mind control experimentation?
Nothing documented. The link is in the mind control experts, the people who are contractors for the CIA and the military, who understand the mind control techniques. Therefore, the military wants to tap into their expertise. Also tend to be people who are experts on mind control techniques of destructive cults. But a direct connection between the cults and the military, the only book I know about that is a book called Was Jonestown a CIA Medical Experiment, written by a man named Michael Myers,
right,
published by the Edwin Mellon Press. And he presents a lot of pretty solid documentation that's not quite 100% conclusive that the CIA was heavily involved in Jonestown.
Right. You've gone into a fair bit of detail in that in your lecture that we've previously aired.
Well, one couple of, just to give a little smattering of the kind of things. One example is that the People's Temple, which was run by Jim Jones, was based in Ukiah, California, which is north of San Francisco. And then they moved down to the jungle in British Guiana. And before I read this book, I never really thought about how did they go about choosing that site. Well, it turns out that that site in the middle of the jungle in British Guiana, immediately before Jim Jones moved down there, it was the site of the CIA's Shalom Project, which was a program for black ex-Green Beret military people to train mercenaries for Angola. And then there's a whole, which obviously couldn't just be coincidence, and then there's just a wealth of other detail like that, connecting all kinds of things in.
In your sense, who do you think is behind all of this? Like
Well, I think I'm sort of not really that much of a conspiracy theorist. I just think that it boils down to typical normal stuff that controls the rest of the world. So it's got to do with military and the government and banks and helicopter sales and spying. So it's no different from who runs radar or who runs jets or who runs anything else. A lot of it's just military contracting, and it's the government, and it's the big business. And I don't personally subscribe to a special conspiracy theory like it. And I don't think there's any one, or at least the evidence I see, I don't think there's any one little group of people who meet in some room, somewhere at the Pentagon, who are pulling all the strings on all this. I think it's much like the federal government. It's all kinds of little groups working at cross purposes, and there's no one grand master design of any kind.
Right. It's a network, the old boys network.
The old boys network is the way I describe it. And that's one reason I think of that is there doesn't have to be some kind of huge. Well, obviously, there is a conspiracy in a sense in that there's secret funding of mind control research, and there's files, and it's kept from the public. But in terms of the stuff that actually documented, there didn't have to be that huge a conspiracy because they just went ahead and published it in the medical literature anyway. The conspiracy is really the sort of old boys network, everybody just looks the other way and knows that they're not supposed to comment on a kind of conspiracy. It's not that anybody has to send out a memo to every psychiatrist in North America saying, keep this secret. Everybody just kind of looks the other way, steers around it, doesn't rock the boat, doesn't make waves.
I've just got a couple more questions. I'm wondering how a person undergoes the healing process that have been traumatized as a child or having participated in the mind control experimentation. What is the process for healing?
Well, some people are probably too damaged to be able to heal. So nobody should claim that they know how to help everybody. Or some people are damaged and they have the ability to heal, but I'm just not going to be able to describe how that should be done. So they need to go to somebody else. But the people that we work with multiple personality who all describe really traumatic childhoods, we don't really, like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we don't really focus on the memories as such. What we deal with is how these different personalities working together as a sort of inner family are getting along with each other, and mostly not getting along with each other. And we try and get them to have more open communication and cooperation with each other, have more of a problem-solving, strategizing kind of approach to life instead of all this conflict and fighting and amnesia. And then we work on building up more healthy, more flexible ways of coping with life. And that's just in a nutshell. To describe in detail that's why my book is 400 pages long.
Right.
It takes quite a while.
And you had mentioned that a lot of, in a particular test that you've done, a lot were able to integrate these personalities back into a kind of a whole. Is that really the goal of the healing process, or?
Well, it's the goal in one sense to be. We're just talking about people with multiple personality. The vast majority of people who are involved in mind control experiments, and the vast majority of people who are abused as children, don't have multiple personality. So I just specialize in that little subgroup, which is only a little, small island in this whole sea of trauma. But the reason integration is the goal for them is basically that it's normal and desirable to be sort of an integrated human being. And if you have a reasonably healthy, happy childhood and adolescence, and you have a reasonably healthy, happy, normal adulthood, you're going to be integrated. You're not going to have multiple personality. But the other reason is because it just works better. It's not that integration is the big goal in and of itself. It's just that integration is a way to get to the goal of far, 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 far less symptoms, much more happy, settled state internally, much better quality of personal relationships, much better functioning in the workplace, and huge reduction in the amount of healthcare and mental health care resources you need.
Now, you mentioned that you are about to release a book about mind control. What specifically will the book deal with, and when will it? Do you expect it to be published?
Well, I'm just finished the second draft of the third draft of the book, so it's been through 3 complete changes, and now the final one, I've done a pretty extensive rewrite of it, and I've got a little bit more information. I'm just sort of digesting and waiting to come in from one of the universities that I got some information from, and then I'll probably go over it one more time kind of stylistically, and then we'll see if we can get a publisher to bite on it. So I'm hoping that it'll be out before the end of 97.
And what specifically are you dealing with in the book?
Basically everything that we've been talking about. The main points are going to be that the U.S. military and the CIA have been creating experimental multiple personality, and that's an established fact because of the documentation. The extent that those people were used in operations is still not really fully known. The fact that you can create artificial multiple personality, to me, proves both that, like I said earlier, that it can be created artificially, and also that it's likely to arise spontaneously. And I go into that in a bunch of detail. And then all this other crazy mind control research, I use that to set the context to make it believable that multiple personality could have been created by the military. Because if you just hear that out of nowhere, it just seems too much to believe. But when you have that whole context, then you realize really it just fits in nicely. And then the other part is to try and stimulate either a presidential commission or some sort of public inquiry into this and get the medical ethics of it really tightened up and make sure that this stuff is not ongoing.
Right.
And get some recognition and compensation for the victims. That's basically the gist of the book.
Do you have evidence of experimental brain implant surgery being done on epilepsy patients?
Well, there's 2 answers to that question. One is that all this documented brain electrode implant research that I described, some of those patients actually had epilepsy, and a whole bunch of them, epilepsy was kind of a phony rationale for putting electrodes in. So when you read that literature, a lot of the time they'll describe the patient as having epilepsy. And then other times they actually put brain electrodes in just for either psychiatric reasons, which were basically bogus reasons, or purely experimental reasons. But epilepsy is one of the rationales for putting brain electrodes in. That's totally documented.
And would these people be informed of that they were to receive brain implants, or?
Yeah, but the sort of explanation for why that was scientifically justified and the informed consent procedure was really iffy.
Yeah. And what literature is available on this subject?
There's a book called Violence in the Brain by Mark and Sweet, published, if I remember the year, like 1970 or 72. It's a little bit hard to get. Or if you go into... part of the problem is you can't do computerized searches of the medical literature before 1966. But if you go to the medical literature in the period 1955 to 1970, and you look for publications by Robert Heath at Tulane University, or Jose Delgado at Yale. You'll find those scattered around in the medical literature.
Okay.
Or you just do literature searches on brain electrode implants. Or then there's a huge literature on LSD. So it's just a matter of really going to the library and searching around.
Right.
Or in the book, like I'll reference a lot of it.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Colin Ross, for joining us on CKLN. It's been very illuminating talking to you, and I wish you all the best with your new book.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for doing a series on this.
We've been listening to an interview with Dr. Colin Ross, a Canadian psychiatrist working with dissociative identity disorder, and has also documented the CIA military mind control experimental programs. Transcripts are available of the lecture that started off this series at the office of CKLN for $2. And the transcripts of this interview will be available in 2 to 3 weeks' time at CKLN. We'll be back next week with more in the Mind Control in Canada radio series on the International Connection here on 88.1 CKLN.